Alright guys, so this is the first video for the immune system. So we are gonna go over our kind of overview of the immune system, some terminology. We'll talk about the innate immune system in this video, okay? So overview for the immune system, there are two major branches of the immune system. You have innate immunity, which would be non-specific. All right, so things like lysozyme and tears that just has an antibiotic effect, the acidity in your stomach that just, non-specifically kills bacteria. All right, and our NK cells we've talked about before, all these things would be innate. All right, so they're not specifically targeting a certain virus or type of bacteria. Okay, so that's non-specific or innate immunity. And then we have adaptive immunity. All right, so adaptive immunity is going to be very specific. All right, so each component of the adaptive immune system is specifically going to be looking for one type of virus or bacteria. All right, so you would have like a specific immune cell that's made to look for the chickenpox virus. All right, if you've had chickenpox before. Okay, so that's the adaptive immune system. Okay, and it involves B and T cells. Okay, so let's talk about innate immunity. So innate immunity, again, this is non-specific. So all of these things aren't targeting a specific type of pathogen, virus, bacteria, anything like that. They're just kind of like the castle walls, right? If we're talking about defenses, right? So these would be like the castle walls with, the catapults, right? Sending out the big balls of fire. They're not targeting an individual. They're just trying to wipe out, all the bad stuff in general. Okay? So innate immunity, we're going to talk about some kind of different categories for different components of the innate immune system. And so the first category is going to be barriers, right? So that's the castle walls, right? Just physical barriers. So obviously the skin is going to be a barrier, right? So that skin is made of stratified, looks like the pen is not quite warmed up this morning. There we go. Stratified squamous epithelium, right? A nice, thick, sturdy, strong barrier to prevent, any kind of bacteria or virus from being able to get through there. We also have lots of mucous membranes everywhere. The respiratory system, the digestive tract, the reproductive tract, the urinary tract, all have mucous membranes, right? And we remember that mucus can trap pathogens, right? To prevent them from moving on to other parts of the body. And then another barrier would be fluid movement, all right? You might not think of this as a barrier, but this essentially will wash away any pathogens. And so this would be tears, for example, are a fluid barrier in your eyes. They keep your, washing across your eyes constantly to, keep bacteria out. Urine helps to keep your urinary tract and your urethra clear of bacteria. What else? Tears, we said. Sweat actually also, to an extent, kind of has a fluid movement effect. Saliva does as well. And then there are also going to be some chemical components we'll talk about in a lot of those things that help to fight bacteria as well. But just the physical washing of those fluids helps to prevent infection and remove pathogens. Okay, so then the next line of defense would be chemicals. So if we're still using our castle analogy, we could think of the barrier as the castle wall, and maybe there's like a moat, right, full of like tar around. This is getting to be a weird analogy, around the castle, okay? And so with our chemical defenses, all right, there's going to be quite a few, okay? And these are just a few of the examples. There's probably more that you can think of. So the skin secretes sebum, right? That's the oil in the skin. It actually does function in the immune system because it is acidic, okay? And it makes the surface of the skin slightly acidic. And so a lot of bacteria are sensitive to pH, so that acidic environment would help to limit bacterial growth. Okay, and then lysozyme we've talked about before. It's an antibiotic. It is found in tears and saliva, right? And so it just kills, anything, viruses, bacteria, anything like that, right? And then mucin is the chemical that forms mucus, all right? And so it will help to trap pathogens, again, like mucus does. Okay, and then the stomach we know makes it gastric juices, which are extremely acidic. Again, that acidity is very harmful to pathogens and will frequently kill them. Then interferon is very interesting. So interferon is a chemical that's released by a cell that's been infected by a virus. All right, and this interferon will actually travel to neighboring cells, kind of like warning them that there's a virus in town, kind of batten down the hatches, close your shutters, that kind of thing. All right, and so that'll actually protect the neighboring cells from the virus. So kind of the last moments of life of this cell that's been infected, it's going to send out the message to tell the other cells that something's up and they need to, start protecting themselves against this virus. That's what interferon does. Okay, and then our last chemical is kind of a big group of chemicals that we're going to talk about. They're called complement proteins. So these proteins are plasma proteins. There's about 20 of them just floating around in your plasma. They have some really cool specific functions, but their general function overall is to promote inflammation in the body. So if you counter some sort of pathogen, this is going to promote inflammation, and inflammation does help to fight, infections and that kind of thing. All right. So with these complement proteins, there's 20 of them, but I want you guys to know one specific one and kind of how it works. And that specific one you should know is called C3. All right. And so C3, that's what we have here. And so when activated, C3 splits into two separate proteins. All right, so it splits into C3A and it splits into C3B. And each of those has a different function. So let's start with C3A. So C3A, what it's going to do is it's going to travel to a mast cell. All right, and it is going to bind to it and it's going to activate the mast cell. All right, so it activates that mast cell. And so that mast cell in response is going to degranulate, right? It's going to release all of that histamine that it's been storing. Okay, and so then we know that histamine that's released, the function of histamine is to cause inflammation. Okay, so C3A activates mast cells release histamine, that histamine leads to inflammation. Okay, and so now let's talk about C3B. It has a couple things that it can do. All right, so what C3B, the first thing it can do is if there's a bacteria around, it will, along with a bunch of other C3Bs, coat the outside of the bacteria. So each one of these things would be a C3B protein. All right, it'll coat the outside of the bacteria, and essentially what that does is it almost adds like little handles to the bacteria that make it much easier for a macrophage, which is what this guy is, to ingest it, to eat it. Okay, so that process is called opsonization, and I love like the actual direct translation of the word opsonization because it's to make tasty. All right, and so that's what these C3B proteins are doing, right? They're making that bacteria tasty so that the macrophage will eat it, right? So it's going to make it easier to phagocytize. Easier to phagocytize. Okay? And so that's opsonization. All right, that's one thing that C3b does. And another thing that C3b can do is, along with other proteins, it can form this structure called a membrane attack complex. All right, and so that's what that is, right? And so basically what it does is that membrane attack complex makes a pore, right? That's why that looks kind of like a tube. All right, it's going to make a pore in a cell. And that's going to allow water to move into the cell. All right, so pore in a cell, water enters, and we know from ANP1 that water entering will cause the cell to swell and possibly even burst, lysis. All right, so that will essentially kill the cell, that membrane attack complex. All right, so that's complement. So you should know that about C3, the functions of C3a and the functions of C3b, okay? But that's it for the complement proteins. And in general, as a general group, complement proteins promote inflammation. And we'll talk about a little later in this chapter what inflammation is exactly. All right, so now let's continue with our innate immune system, talking about types of cells. All right, so the types of cells that are part of the innate immune system. And so just as a little review of a couple terms, we talked about these with our blood chapter, but these cells undergo what is called chemotaxis. So chemotaxis just means that that cell is moving towards some sort of chemical signal. So if other parts of the maybe adaptive immune system encounter something and they signal they've found a pathogen, that signal will draw these innate immune cells, the macrophages and that kind of thing, towards that signal. And so to reach it, they obviously need to get out of the blood. And so they do that through diapedesis. And so diapedesis is just this process drawn here of that cell squeezing in between the simple squamous cells of the blood vessel. All right, so then our first type of cell is a phagocyte. And so we've been talking about these a little bit. So phagocytes are macrophages. They're going to be eating things, kind of cleaning up, the environment around, once another type of cell, maybe an adaptive immune cell, kills a pathogen, these phagocytes can come in and kind of clean up that debris and get rid of it. So there can be two types. Oh yeah, also these phagocytes, remember, come from monocytes. So these are monocytes that have left the bloodstream, all right? And so they can either be wandering, just meaning they kind of traverse throughout the body between different types of tissues, or they can be fixed. And so fixed macrophages, generally, they just live in a single tissue or organ, and they get a special name. So we've talked about last semester, an example you learned about would be microglia or microglia, right? So those are the macrophages in the brain, right? That would be a fixed macrophage. We talked about the alveolar macrophages in the lungs, all right? You also talked about Langerhans cells in the skin, all right? Or dendritic cells, just depending on what you call them, all right, in the skin that are also macrophages, okay? So these are fixed because they stay in that specific tissue. Also, osteoclasts in bone would be an example of this as well, all right? And then another type of macrophage that you've learned about is the neutrophils. And so neutrophils are those white blood cells that are the first responders. If you remember kind of what they look like, right? They were the cells that had kind of this crazy blobby nucleus, right? Like this, that was in lobes. They're the first responder to the site of some sort of infection, as well as being the most abundant of white blood cells. Okay, and then we have our NK cells, our natural killer cells. So these are a type of lymphocyte, all right, and their function is to kill any abnormal cells, all right? So let's write a little reminder. These are lymphocytes, okay? And they kill any abnormal cell, and they do this by releasing perforins. And so perforins kind of work similar to that membrane attack complex, but instead of forming a pore, they literally just poke a bunch of tiny little holes in a cell until, enough water seeps in that cell is going to burst. All right, so this would also, similar to that membrane attack complex, would allow water to enter. All right, just instead of forming a protein pore, we're just going to poke holes in it. That's what perforins do, and they're released by NK cells. So I like to think of these guys, these NK cells, as like the little ninjas, right, of the body. And so they throw, I think of perforins as like the little ninja throwing stars, right, that they throw out if we're thinking like, cartoon ninjas, right? And they poke a bunch of little holes in the cell and kill it. Okay, so then we have, for another kind of adaptive response, those were all cells of the, or not adaptive, cells of the innate immune system. So another innate response that we talked about is inflammation, okay? And so we mentioned this just a second ago with the complement protein. And so inflammation is a non-specific response to any kind of tissue injury, all right? So this would be a response to tissue injury. Okay, and so one of the main factors that contributes to inflammation, this would be in addition to like our complement proteins, but a main contributor to inflammation is going to be histamine. And we saw that our C3A actually activated the mast cells to release histamine. Okay, so histamine can be released by basophils, or it can be released by mast cells. So basophils, remember, are white blood cells, right? So they're in the blood, and typically mast cells are going to be more so found wandering in the tissues. All right, so that's kind of how they're different. And the response to this histamine is going to be vasodilation. So the blood vessels are going to dilate, bringing more blood to the area and also bringing a lot more cells, white blood cells, and they're going to attract phagocytes to the area. Okay, and so the signs of inflammation are redness, right? So that would be from that increased blood flow from that vasodilation. That would make the area red for sure, as well as hot. Okay, so that would be from increased blood as well. Bringing more blood to the area is going to make that area hot. Swelling could be from increased blood flow, but it can also be from increased cells. Right? Cells, white blood cells, phagocytes are all going to be moving into that area, chemotaxis, right? They're going to move towards that histamine signal. All right, and then pain definitely is part of inflammation, right? So this swelling and, damage and a lot of extra blood flow is going to actually cause pain as well. Okay. And then our last innate kind of response is going to be fever. So in general, fever, the definition is that there's an increase systemically in body temperature, right? Versus this heat would be more localized to where inflammation is. A fever is systemic, so body-wide increase in temperature. Okay, and so the signals that cause fever are called pyrogens, all right? Which I like that name, right? Like a pyromaniac is somebody who likes to play with fire, right? So pyrogens cause heat to build up in the body, right? So pyrogens cause fever, and they do that by acting on the hypothalamus, right? So that region of the brain has many functions, but one of them is to maintain body temperature. Okay, so pyrogens act on the hypothalamus, and they can come from two different places. So they can be endogenous, meaning that they're made by our own cells, specifically our white blood cells. All right, so those white blood cells tell the brain, hey, there's a kind of intruder. We need to kind of build up a fever to help get rid of that intruder. Or they can be exogenous, so the surface, the outside of the actual pathogen can act as a pyrogen to trigger fever, right? It's recognized as being abnormal, it's an invader, and that will trigger a fever as well. Okay? All right, so that's the adaptive immune system. So then in the next video, or sorry, I keep mixing up my words, right? That will be the innate immune system. The next video, we're going to pick up and talk about the adaptive immune system, which is much more complicated. All right, so we'll need 2 videos to talk about that.